Hey everyone! In this video, I want to do a deeper dive into the basics of taxation, which is one of the 5 policy tools I use on this channel. Now, I think everyone knows what a tax is, but I think there's some interesting nuances that we can look at. And this video will give us the basics of what do all taxes have in common, and what are the things that we should look at when we're looking at some specific tax issues. So with that, let's get right into it. And let's start by looking at a basic supply and demand graph. And so a supply and demand graph has price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis and includes 2 lines. The first is a demand curve, and this represents the maximum price people are willing to pay to buy a good. It's a downward sloping line because as the price goes down, more people are willing to buy the good. The other line is the supply curve, which represents the minimum price sellers need to bring a good to market. It's an upward sloping line because as the price goes up, more people are willing to produce and sell a given good. So this is the situation without any taxes. Where the 2 lines cross is the market equilibrium price and the market equilibrium quantity. So now let's look at a tax. Let's start with a tax on suppliers. Suppliers will charge their minimum amount, which is the purple line, plus the tax, which we'll represent with this blue line. So now to find the new equilibrium, we look for the maximum quantity where buyers are willing to pay this new price. And so we'll move the tax up until we hit the demand curve. And this right here is already going to tell us a lot about the effect of taxes. The first effect is that the buyers actually have to pay a higher price now than without the tax. And this may be one reason governments actually institute the tax. Take for instance a tariff. Tariffs are designed to increase the price of foreign goods and make domestic goods more preferable by comparison. The second effect of taxes that we can see here is that the seller price actually decreases. And again, this may be a reason governments institute a tax. Take for instance a speculation tax. It's designed to reduce income that sellers make in a given market. The third effect of a tax is that it lowers the quantity. And this is the thinking behind many sin taxes. For instance, a tobacco tax is designed to reduce the number of people who smoke. The fourth effect of taxes is tax revenue. And this is also something that we can see on this graph, given that your revenue will be the quantity times the size of the tax. So it can be represented by this rectangle here. And of course, tax revenue is one of the big reasons that governments use taxation. One other thing we can see on this graph is actually this triangle here. And it represents something economists call the excess burden. And what it is the loss that buyers see from the tax, from the higher price, and those who are now priced out of the market, and the loss that sellers experience from the lower prices they receive, including sellers who are no longer in the market, less the tax revenue. In other words, it's the difference between what people lose because of the tax minus what the tax revenue is. And that will always be either 0 in some very limited cases, or positive. So there will always be an economic loss to the tax, which we can see in this triangle here. So up to this point, we've been talking about a tax on suppliers. Well, what if the tax is on the buyers? Well, in that case, they will be willing to pay their maximum amount to the suppliers less what they have to pay in the tax, given that it doesn't matter to them if the money goes to the supplier or to the government. They just have the one bill at the end of the day. So let's look at that situation. So now we'll find the maximum quantity where sellers are willing to sell for that price. So again, we'll move up to where we hit the supply curve. And as you can see, it looks exactly the same as when the tax is on suppliers. And this is something that's generally true. It doesn't matter if the tax is on the seller or on the buyer. However, I will say there is some literature out of the behavioral economics space that looks at how visible a tax is and how that affects the market. So The concept of tax salience, which is, is the tax embedded in the sticker price? Is it applied at the till? May have an impact on the market, but that's something we'll consider in a future video. So up to now, I've been showing a graph that suggests that taxes is pretty well evenly impacting buyers and sellers, but that's not necessarily the case. It will depend on the relative price elasticities or the relative slopes of these two lines. Take, for instance, this example, which has the same starting market equilibrium price and market equilibrium quantity, but has a much flatter supply curve and a much steeper demand curve. So again, we'll take the same price, so the same size, and again, move it up until we hit the demand curve. As you can see, in this situation, the effect on buyers is much more significant since they have a much higher price than in the previous example, but it's much less of an effect on sellers who don't see much of a price difference. But these effects will not only affect the prices, it's also going to affect the quantity, the size of the tax revenue, and the size of the excess burden. So in any given market, the situation could be quite different for all of these intended effects. Now let's look back at the original graph, because there are a few other costs we need to consider. The first is compliance costs. So if complying with a tax involves a team of lawyers and accountants, it can be quite costly. So the suppliers will charge their minimum price. Again, they'll charge the tax on top of that, and they will need to recover their compliance costs, which we will represent with this red line here. So now we'll do as we did before and find the maximum quantity where buyers are willing to pay that amount. As you can see, the compliance cost exacerbates the effect of a tax. It has a greater impact on prices for both buyers and sellers, and has a greater impact on quantity. However, it does decrease the amount of tax revenue, given that the tax is the same size, but the quantity is lower. It also increases the size of the excess burden. The other cost we need to consider is administrative cost. So every time you file your taxes, the person who reviews that needs to be paid. And so that's the administrative costs, the cost that governments incur in administering and collecting the tax. And while this can't be seen directly in the graph, what it does do is reduce the net tax revenue that the governments receive from any given tax. And so that covers the mechanics of a tax and the 5 effects that it has. Increase in buyer price, decrease in seller price, decrease in quantity, a tax revenue, and an excess burden. But so what are the factors that policymakers look at when they're thinking about tax as a policy? And really, there are 3 things. The first is efficiency. And this refers to the ratio between the tax revenue and the excess burden. Naturally, governments want to maximize their tax revenue while limiting the amount of economic damage. And so this is how we calculate the efficiency of a tax. Secondly, there's equity, and that can be broken into 2. The first is horizontal equity. And this is the concept that those who have the same capacity to pay taxes, often measured through their annual income, should pay roughly the same amount in tax. Although we can clearly see situations where that wouldn't be the case. Take, for instance, 2 people who earn $50,000 a year. If one of them is a smoker and pays the tobacco tax and the other is not a smoker, the smoker will pay a higher tax. The second equity concept is vertical equity, which says that those who have a higher capacity to pay, again, often through higher incomes, should pay a higher proportion of taxes. And so this gets to the progressivity of a tax. A tax is considered progressive if, as your income goes up, the proportion of your income that you pay in taxes increases. A tax is proportional if the percent of income that you pay in tax stays the same regardless of your income. And a tax is considered regressive if lower income individuals pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. So So note there that a tax can be regressive even if higher income people pay more taxes if it's still a lower percentage of their income. The third policy consideration for tax is what I spoke about earlier. Do you want to increase price for a good? Do you want to decrease the seller price for a good? Do you want to decrease quantity? And how big of an effect will that be is the third policy condition. And so that's it. That's the basics of taxation. And we will use this as our starting point when we do some deeper dive into some specific taxes and some specific tax issues. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.